On the morning of the 15th of August, 2019, an Airbus A321 lifted off from an airport outside Moscow with 233 people aboard, and 10 seconds later it flew into a flock of gulls. Both engines swallowed birds. Neither engine stopped, and yet 90 seconds after leaving the runway, the airliner was lying on its belly in a cornfield, with its landing gear still tucked away, everyone aboard alive, and a nation already reaching for the word miracle. Within days, the two pilots would be named heroes of the Russian Federation by the president himself. Within 4 years, there would be a feature film, and locked in a drawer for 6 years, unpublished and inconvenient, would be the official report, the one that found that the airplane had never actually lost the power to fly, and that the men being decorated as heroes had, in 90 terrible seconds, done almost everything wrong. This is the story of Ural Airlines Flight 178. There is a kind of accident that is genuinely difficult to write about, not because the engineering is hard, but because the truth is uncomfortable in more than one direction at once. Ural Airlines Flight 178 is one of those. Tell it as the world first heard it. A doomed airliner, both engines dead, brought down onto a field by the cool hands of a hero pilot, everyone saved, and you are telling a lie, but a lie that contains a real and beautiful fact. 233 people walked away from a crash that could very easily have killed them all. Tell it as the investigators eventually found it, a crew who mishandled a survivable emergency and were rescued by luck and the crashworthiness of a modern airplane. And you are telling the truth, but a truth that risks erasing the same real and beautiful fact, and that curdles, if you are not careful, into contempt for two frightened men who had 90 seconds to save an airplane that the rulebook did not know how to save. Both of these stories are true. The accident sits in the narrow, painful space between them, and what makes Flight 178 worth telling, what lifts it above a simple case study in engine-out procedure, is what a state chose to do with that space. Faced with an event that was part survival and part failure, the Russian government did not wait for the failure to be understood. It reached in, took the survival, and built a monument on top of it, fast, before anyone could examine the foundations. The medals were awarded before the flight recorders had given up their secrets. The film was made before the report was published, and the report, when it was finally finished, was quietly held back from public view for years, because it did not say what the monument said. This is a story about 90 seconds over a Moscow suburb. It is also a story about what happens when a country needs a hero more than it needs a lesson. Ural Airlines is a Russian carrier based in Yekaterinburg, the large industrial city on the eastern flank of the Ural Mountains that gives the airline its name, and gives it, too, its radio call sign, Sverdlovsk, after the city's Soviet-era name. By the summer of 2019, it was a solid, unglamorous operator of Airbus narrow bodies, flying domestic and regional routes across Russia and beyond. The kind of airline that most of its passengers chose because of the schedule and the fare, and never thought about again. Flight 178 was one of those forgettable workhorses. An early morning service from Zhukovsky International Airport, southeast of Moscow, to Simferopol in Crimea. It was peak summer, the height of the holiday season, and the airplane was full. 226 passengers, most of them Russians heading south to the Black Sea coast, along with a handful of citizens of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Looking after them were 5 cabin crew. On the flight deck sat 2 pilots. It was, in every particular, an ordinary flight, and it was about to become one of the most famous 90 seconds in the modern history of Russian aviation. The airport itself deserves a moment, because the accident began not in the cockpit but on the ground around the runway, years before the airplane ever arrived. Zhukovsky, known for most of its history as Rahmenskoye, is one of the storied names of Soviet and Russian aviation. It is home to the Gromov Flight Research Institute. It hosts the Great Max Air Show, and its enormous runway has seen the first flights of some of the most exotic machines ever built. In 2016, a corner of this vast flight test complex was opened as a commercial passenger airport, Moscow's 4th, and it sat, as it had always sat, in a landscape that was catastrophically attractive to birds. Around the field there were bodies of water, and there were waste dumps, including, the investigation would later find, illegal ones. And where there is standing water and rubbish, there are gulls, large gulls, European herring gulls and Caspian gulls. Birds that can weigh well over a kilogram, that gather in flocks, and that a jet engine is not designed to eat by the handful. The people who run airports are supposed to manage this. They are supposed to eliminate the things that attract birds and actively frighten away the ones that come anyway, every day, as a matter of routine. At Zhukovsky, the investigators concluded, this was not being done adequately. And behind that local failure sat a national one. The regulation that governed bird control at Russian airports was an old Soviet-derived document, out of step with international standards and with modern ornithological knowledge. And the system as a whole was simply not taking the threat of birds as seriously as the threat deserved. None of this was visible to the crew of Flight 178 as they taxied out in the clear early light. It was a beautiful morning, good visibility, a light breeze, the sky an innocuous summer blue. The trap had been laid over years out of sight, and they were about to spring it. In the left seat was Captain Damir Yusupov, in his early 40s, an experienced Airbus pilot who had come to flying relatively late in life after an earlier career, and who had accumulated several thousand hours on the A320 family, several hundred of them in command. In the right seat was First Officer Georgy Murzin, just 23 years old, a very junior pilot with well under 1,000 hours to his name. Neither man had any mark against his record. Both held valid licenses and medicals. They were, by every measure available before that morning, an ordinary and competent line crew. It matters to say this clearly, and to keep saying it, because the analysis that follows is going to be hard on their performance, and it would be easy to let the criticism harden into a caricature of a bumbling crew. That is not what this is. What follows is a study of two normal pilots colliding with an abnormal situation, one that their training had prepared them for only in part, and that the certification of their own aircraft had never fully anticipated, and of the specific, comprehensible ways in which, under a pressure most of us will never experience, they got it wrong. At about 6:15 in the morning, local time, Flight 178 began its takeoff roll on runway 12 at Zhukovsky. The takeoff was being flown, as most are, at a reduced thrust setting, a normal fuel and engine-saving technique in which the engines are deliberately not run at full power, because on a long runway with a given weight, full power is not needed. The particular setting that morning is recorded as a flex temperature of 49 degrees, which is simply a way of telling the engines to produce less than their maximum. Hold that detail. It will matter. The airplane accelerated normally, reached its decision speed and its rotation speed, both around 166 knots, and lifted off the runway at roughly 180 knots, pitching up to a normal initial climb attitude of 12 or 13 degrees. Everything, for a few seconds, was exactly as it should be. The gear was still down. Retraction is commanded a moment after liftoff, once the airplane is safely climbing. The A321 rose into the morning air, and its nose swung out over the flat green country southeast of Moscow. And then, about 10 seconds after the wheels left the ground, at little more than 100 feet, the airplane flew into the gulls. It was not one bird. The investigators would eventually determine that at least 15 birds struck the aircraft, hammering the fuselage, the wings, and, fatally for the flight's prospects, the engines. The left engine ingested 3 of them, one of which fell squarely into the large bird category, the size of a small dog. The right engine took at least 1, and another bird, or its remains, struck a sensor. To the crew, in the cockpit, it was sudden and violent and loud. A series of bangs, a shudder, the smell of scorched birds, and then the sickening surging of engines that were no longer running smoothly. Warnings began to appear. The airplane, which a heartbeat earlier had been climbing away cleanly, stopped climbing, and here the crew's understanding of their situation diverged, for the first time, from the reality, because it felt, and it sounded, as though their engines had died. The natural, overwhelming assumption in that cockpit was that they had suffered a double-engine failure 10 seconds after takeoff, the single most feared event in all of aviation, the scenario that begins the story of the miracle on the Hudson. But that is not what had happened, and the difference between what had happened and what it felt like had happened is the entire accident. Neither engine failed. This is the fact around which everything else turns, and it is worth stating as plainly as possible. At no point in the 90 seconds of Flight 178 did either of the airplane's engines stop producing power. The left engine, having swallowed 3 birds, was badly hurt. Its thrust collapsed to almost nothing, but it kept turning, kept running, kept generating electricity. The right engine was in better shape. It had ingested only 1 bird, and its damage was more subtle. Some fan blade damage, yes, but the more consequential injury was to a sensor, which caused the engine's control system to wind its power back well below the takeoff setting. The right engine was, in effect, throttled down by its own computers on the basis of bad information, running at perhaps 80% of the thrust it should have been giving, when the crew needed every bit of it and more. We know all of this with certainty because of the physical evidence, which is grimly poetic. When investigators reached the cornfield, they found the corn stalks in front of the right engine violently flattened, the mark of an engine still blowing appreciable air at the moment of impact. Deep inside the core of the left engine they found vegetation, ingested corn, proof that it too was still running when the airplane hit the ground. The generators had powered the airplane throughout. The ram air turbine, the little emergency windmill that deploys automatically when a jet loses all its normal power, had never come out, because the airplane had never lost all its power. Every scrap of evidence pointed to the same conclusion, and the flight recorders later confirmed it beyond argument. Flight 178 was, the whole way down, a flying airplane with 2 running engines. It simply did not have enough thrust, in the configuration the crew had left it in, to climb. To understand why that combination was so dangerous, 2 running engines and no climb, you have to understand a specific and rather beautiful assumption buried in the way airliners are certified, and the exact way Flight 178 fell through the crack in it. Every twin-engine airliner is required by law to be able to survive the failure of one engine at the worst possible moment. At takeoff, just after the decision speed, when it is heavy and low and slow, it must be able to keep climbing on the one engine that remains. To a safe altitude, the A321 could do this easily. But, and here is the crack, the requirement assumes that the surviving engine is producing full takeoff thrust. The whole edifice of single-engine performance rests on the idea that when one engine quits, the other one is a healthy engine at full power. Flight 178 was not that scenario. Flight 178 was a scenario the rulebook had never contemplated. Not one dead engine and one healthy engine, but 2 damaged engines, neither of them dead, neither of them healthy. The sum of their crippled outputs adding up to less than a single good engine would have produced. On top of that, remember the flex takeoff. The engines had been set deliberately to less than maximum power, and the automatic systems did not simply firewall them back to full when the birds hit. The airplane found itself in a state for which there was no certified guarantee of performance, no tested behavior, no procedure that fit exactly it was. In the language of the investigation, outside the expected operating conditions, the aircraft had been designed and tested against. And yet this is the crucial finding, the one that reframes the entire event. The airplane was not even so incapable of flight. The MAK, the Interstate Aviation Committee that investigated the crash, ran a fresh engineering simulation to answer the question directly. With the thrust the engines were actually producing, could this airplane have kept flying? The answer was a qualified, agonizing yes. With the landing gear extended, the configuration Flight 178 was actually in. No, the drag was too high, and the airplane could not climb or even hold altitude without bleeding away its precious speed. But with the landing gear retracted, the very same thrust produced a positive climb, not a good climb, a climb gradient of about 1.5%, well below the 2.4% the airplane was supposed to achieve, but a climb. Gear up on the power it actually had, Flight 178 could have clawed its way upward, and perhaps come back around to the runway. The gear was not up, and the reason it was not up is the story of the 90 seconds. It is worth pausing on exactly why the rulebook had no answer for Flight 178. Because the gap is not an oversight so much as an honest limit of what can be tested. A modern jet engine is deliberately and expensively certified against birds before it is ever allowed to fly passengers. Engineers fire bird carcasses out of a compressed air cannon into a running engine on a test stand and watch what happens. The standards are specific and graduated. There is a large bird test in which a single big bird, several pounds of it, is fired into the engine, and the requirement is not that the engine keep running at full power, but that it fail safely, that it shut down without flinging shrapnel out through its casing, without catching fire, without becoming a danger to the airplane. There are medium bird and small bird tests, meant to simulate flying through a flock, in which a number of smaller birds are ingested at once, and here the requirement is more demanding. The engine must not only avoid a hazardous failure, but must retain a substantial fraction of its thrust, so that an airplane flying through a flock does not lose all its engines at once. These standards are good, and they have saved lives, and every engine on every airliner has passed them. But look at what they assume. They test one engine at a time. They certify that a single engine hit by a single large bird will fail gracefully, and that a single engine hit by a flock of small ones will keep enough thrust to matter. What they cannot easily capture is the specific, statistically awkward event in which two engines are hit at the same instant by different amounts of bird, one engine taking a crippling load of large birds while the other takes a lighter hit that a faulty sensor then amplifies into a deep thrust rollback. Each engine, individually, behaved within the envelope of what its certification anticipated. The left engine did not explode, it degraded. The right engine did not fail, it wound down. But the airplane is certified on the assumption that if one engine is lost, the other is whole. And on Flight 178, neither of those things was true. Both engines were partly there. The sum was not enough, and no cannon on any test stand had ever fired that particular pattern of birds into that particular pair of engines to see what an airplane would do. The crew were flying an experiment nobody had run. Here is what a crew is supposed to do when an engine fails on takeoff. The actions are so fundamental that they are committed to memory items, the reflexes that a line pilot rehearses in the simulator every few months, until they are as automatic as a prayer. Fly the airplane. Set maximum thrust on the good engine. Keep the wings level and the nose at the right attitude for the best climb. Balance the yaw with the rudder, because a big engine failure shoves the nose hard to one side. And if you do not push the opposite rudder pedal, the airplane skids through the air sideways, generating enormous drag. Retract the gear on schedule to clean up the airplane. Watch the speed like a hawk, because speed is life. These are not obscure techniques. They are the bedrock of multi-engine flying. Under the hammer blow of the bird strike, with the airplane shuddering and the warnings blaring, and perhaps 80 feet of air beneath them, the crew of Flight 178 did almost none of these things. They did not apply full thrust to the working right engine, the engine that had power to give. They did not retract the landing gear, which stayed hanging in the airflow, dragging the whole way down. As the airplane refused to climb, Captain Yusupov pulled back on his sidestick, raising the nose still higher, trying to will the aircraft upward, but pulling the nose up on an airplane that is already short of thrust does not make it climb, it makes it slow down. The airplane leveled off, wallowing, and its airspeed began to decay toward the stall. And then a subtle, terrible thing happened, the kind of detail that only a flight recorder reveals. Yusupov, fighting the airplane, began to relax the pressure on the rudder pedal, unconsciously, as a man under extreme stress will let his feet drift. With the left engine producing almost nothing and the right engine producing more, the airplane wanted to yaw toward the dead side. Only rudder was holding it straight, and as the rudder came off, the nose slid to the left, and the fuselage turned partly across the oncoming wind. Now the airplane was not only dragging its gear and holding too high a pitch, it was flying slightly sideways, presenting its flank to the air, adding still more drag, bleeding still more speed. Every instinct the captain was following was making the situation worse. He keyed the radio and began to transmit an emergency call, pan, Sverdlovsk, and never finished the sentence. There was no time. There was, in truth, never very much time at all. It became clear within seconds that the airplane was not going to fly. It could not climb. It was slowing. The ground was very close. Returning to the runway was out of the question. They were too low, sinking, pointed the wrong way. Captain Yusupov did the only thing left to do, and this part he did well. He chose a place to put the airplane down, and he flew it there. Ahead and slightly to the left, beyond the airport boundary, lay a large cornfield, the maize standing about 3 meters tall in the August ripeness. Yusupov pointed the wounded A321 at it. He did not extend the landing gear. It was still up from never having been retracted in the first place, and for a landing on soft, uneven ground, Gear up is very often the safer choice, keeping the airplane from digging in a wheel and cartwheeling. He held the wings level, and a little over a minute and a half after it had left the runway at Zhukovsky, Flight 178 mushed down into the corn, belly first, the right engine nacelle touching the crop before anything else, and slid to a halt through the flattened stalks. There was no fire. This was not a small thing. It was, in a sense, the whole thing. A belly landing with running, damaged engines and full fuel tanks is a recipe for a fireball. And the reasons it did not happen that morning include the green dampness of the standing corn and a substantial measure of pure luck. The fuel tanks held. The airplane came to rest more or less intact, upright in the field. The evacuation slides deployed, and 233 people climbed and jumped and stumbled out into the maze and away from the airplane. Every one of them survived. Something in the region of 24 to several dozen people were hurt, bruises, sprains, the injuries of a hard arrival and a scrambling evacuation. But no one was killed and no one was maimed, and within hours the passengers of Flight 178 were on buses, shaken and alive, telling their families that the airplane had come down in a field and that somehow, impossibly, they were all right. The airplane, an 11-year-old Airbus A321 registered Victor Quebec Bravo Oscar Zulu, would never fly again. It lay in the cornfield near the village of Rybaki, substantially damaged, and it was, in due course, written off. But it had done the last and most important thing an airplane can do. It had held together, and it had kept its people alive, even as it was flown into the ground. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was enormous, and it arrived long before anyone understood what had actually happened. By that afternoon, Russian television had a story, and it was a magnificent one. Both engines knocked out by a flock of birds seconds after takeoff, a packed airliner doomed, and a captain of ice-cold nerve who had glided his stricken machine onto a cornfield and saved every soul aboard. It was, the commentator said, a Russian answer to the miracle on the Hudson, the 2009 ditching in which an American captain, Shili Sullenberger, put an Airbus down on a river after a bird strike took both his engines. The comparison wrote itself. Here was Russia's own Sully, its own miracle, its own proof that in the hands of a real airman, a hopeless situation could be redeemed. The word miracle attached itself to Flight 178 within hours and never came off. And 2 days later, on the 17th of August, 2019, before the flight data recorder had been fully read, before the engines had been stripped and examined, before the investigators had done more than begin, the President of Russia signed a decree. Captain Damir Yusupov and First Officer Georgy Morzin were named heroes of the Russian Federation, the nation's highest honorary title, a gold star worn by cosmonauts and generals and the bravest of the brave. The 5 cabin crew were awarded the Order of Courage. The country had its heroes, gold-starred and official, while the airplane they had flown was still lying in the corn. And the reasons it was lying there were entirely unknown. There is nothing sinister on its face about a country celebrating the survival of 233 of its citizens. The relief was real. The passengers were genuinely alive. The impulse to honor the men at the controls is a deeply human one. But an accident investigation is a machine for learning the truth, and it runs on a particular kind of patience, a willingness to not know, to suspend judgment, to follow the evidence to wherever it leads, even if that place is uncomfortable. By awarding the highest possible honor to the crew 48 hours after the event, the state did something that would shape everything that followed. It rendered a verdict. It declared, with the full authority of the head of state, that what these men had done was heroic and correct, and it did so before the one institution whose job was to find out what they had actually done had barely started to work. You cannot easily investigate a hero. Once the gold star is pinned on, every finding that complicates the heroism becomes an attack on a decorated man, an unpatriotic act, an insult to a national symbol. The medal did not just honor the crew, it fenced them off. The investigation was conducted by the MAK, the Interstate Aviation Committee, the body responsible for civil aviation accident investigation across much of the former Soviet Union, with technical support from the Gromov Flight Research Institute. Right there at Zhukovsky, the flight recorders were recovered from the cornfield intact and readable. The engines were removed and torn down. The birds, or what remained of them, were collected and identified. And slowly, over months, The machine of investigation assembled the picture that the machine of publicity had leapt straight past. The flight data recorder told the story of the 90 seconds in pitiless numerical detail. The normal takeoff, the strike, the collapse of thrust on the left engine, and the sensor-driven rollback on the right, the gear that stayed down, the thrust that was never advanced to maximum, the nose that was pulled up, the speed that decayed, the rudder that came off, the yaw and the descent into the field. The cockpit voice recorder captured the human side, the noise, the confusion, the truncated pan-pan call, the crew working the problem in the only 90 seconds they had, and the engine teardown delivered the finding that detonated the official narrative. Neither engine had failed. Both had been running the entire time. The miracle on the Hudson comparison, 2 dead engines, a genuine glider, did not fit because Flight 178 had never been a glider. It had been an underpowered airplane whose crew had not given it the 2 things it needed, which were full thrust and a clean configuration. From these facts, the MAK drew its conclusions, and they were unsparing. The proximate cause of the accident was the crew's failure to fly the airplane correctly in response to the bird strike. The failure to set takeoff thrust on the operative engines, the failure to retract the landing gear, the excessive nose-up input that decayed the airspeed, and the loss of directional control from inadequate rudder. Any one of these, corrected, might have changed the outcome. The retraction of the gear alone, the simulation showed, would have given the airplane a positive rate of climb. The crew had been handed a bad situation, a genuinely bad one, outside the certified envelope, with birds in both engines, and they had made it worse rather than better. And they had been saved by the strength of the airframe and the softness of the field, and a large amount of luck. And now we have to stop and hold the other truth, because the MAK's findings are not the same as saying the crew were fools, or that the outcome was easy. Consider what they were actually facing. 10 seconds after liftoff at 100 feet, in the space of a single heartbeat, both engines began to surge and bang and lose power simultaneously. Nothing in that experience announces itself, as your left engine has lost most of its thrust, and your right engine has been throttled back by a faulty sensor. But both are still running, and if you clean up the airplane, you can climb at 1.5%. What it announces itself as is catastrophe. A double-engine failure at the worst moment of flight, the nightmare that every pilot dreads and almost none ever face. The crew had seconds, not minutes. They had no altitude to trade for time. And the situation was, genuinely and by the investigators' own admission, one that the aircraft had never been certified to handle, and that no checklist described exactly. The MAK itself acknowledged the crucial caveat. Even if the crew had done everything correctly, a safe recovery was not guaranteed. The engines were damaged and their behavior was unpredictable. The thrust that the simulation used was the thrust they happened to be producing. But a further surge or a full failure could have come at any second. The margin, even flown perfectly, was razor thin. So it is not the case that a competent crew would obviously have flown away and that only these 2 failed. It is the case that flying away was possible, that the procedures existed to attempt it, and that the crew did not execute them. And also that they were human beings in an impossible 90 seconds, and that the thing they did do at the very end was choose a survivable place to crash and fly the airplane into it, wings level, without killing anybody. That last part is not nothing. A great many bird strike accidents at low altitude have ended in fire and mass death. Flight 178 ended with everyone alive. The captain's decision to commit to the field, to land gear up, to keep it level, that was airmanship of a real if narrow kind. The tragedy of the official story is not that it praised the crew. It is that it praised them for the wrong thing, and in doing so, made it impossible to learn from what they got wrong. The comparison the Russian media reached for, the miracle on the Hudson, is worth taking seriously, not as propaganda but as analysis, because holding the 2 events side by side reveals exactly what Flight 178 was and was not. On the 15th of January 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, the smaller sister of the A321, took off from LaGuardia in New York, and about a minute and a half into the climb, flew into a flock of Canada geese. These are enormous birds, far larger than gulls, and both of the A320's engines ingested them. But here is the difference that matters. On Flight 1549, the engines genuinely, comprehensively failed. They did not degrade or roll back. They lost essentially all thrust and could not be recovered. Captain Sheasley Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skills were flying a true glider at low altitude over one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. There was no configuration change that would make their airplane climb, because there was no thrust to be had. And within that genuinely hopeless situation, the crew did the trained things with a discipline that is the actual reason the event became a byword for airmanship. Skills, the pilot monitoring, immediately began the engine restart procedure. Sullenberger, recognizing almost at once that the engines were gone, and that neither a return to LaGuardia nor a diversion to a nearby airport was achievable, started the auxiliary power unit, a small turbine in the tail that kept the airplane's electrical and hydraulic systems, and crucially its flight control computers, fully powered and in their most protective mode. He managed the airplane's energy with precision, kept the wings level, held the correct speed, and put the airplane onto the Hudson River in a controlled ditching that everyone survived. The Hudson was a case of a crew extracting the maximum possible from a situation that offered almost nothing. Now set Flight 178 beside it. Superficially they rhyme, same manufacturer, same family of airplane, same trigger of birds in both engines just after takeoff, same eventual off-airport arrival with everyone alive. But underneath, they are near opposites. Sullenberger's airplane could not fly and he flew it perfectly. Yusupov's airplane could still fly, barely, in the wrong configuration, on damaged engines. But it could, and it was not flown in the way that would have let it. The Hudson crew were handed a glider and gave it the best possible ending. The Zhukovsky crew were handed an underpowered airplane and did not give it the thrust and the clean configuration that the numbers, in hindsight, say it needed. That is not said to diminish two frightened men who saved their passengers' lives at the last. It is said because the comparison the state chose to draw, Russia's own miracle on the Hudson, is, when you actually examine it, the precise comparison that reveals how different and how much more troubling Flight 178 really was. While the investigators worked, the legend grew, and it grew in the characteristic shapes of its time. During the evacuation, the senior flight attendant, a man named Dmitry Ivlitsky, had directed passengers away from the aircraft with a phrase that was calm, practical, and, in retrospect, strangely lyrical. To go to the right, into the sun, along the rows of corn. Somebody remembered it. It was repeated. It went, in the language of the age, viral. It became a caption, a joke, a slogan. The airline itself printed it on T-shirts. A moment of genuine crew coordination in a crisis was refined by the great machine of the internet into a piece of merchandise. And then, in 2023, came the film. A dramatization of the cornfield miracle reached Russian cinemas, produced within the confident patriotic register of contemporary Russian popular culture. The heroic captain, the doomed airliner, the impossible landing, the nation's pride. It told the story exactly as the decree of August 2019 had framed it. Catastrophe and heroism, without complication. It did not, and could not, incorporate the findings of an investigation that had not been made public. By the time Russian audiences were watching the miracle reenacted on screen, the actual report, the one that said the airplane could have climbed, that the crew had erred, that the birds had been invited by a badly run airport, was finished and sitting unpublished, and had been for over a year. This is the part of the story that gives it its particular character and its title. The MAK completed its investigation and produced its final report, a detailed technical document of some 200 pages, in April of 2022, nearly 3 years after the accident, and then it did not release it. Not that month, not that year, not the year after. The finished report simply did not appear, held back for what were later described as bureaucratic reasons, an approval that could not be obtained at some higher level. For years, the definitive account of one of the most famous accidents in modern Russian aviation history existed but could not be read. A copy did eventually leak, which is how the world came to know the findings at all, but the official document, the authoritative public record, stayed in its drawer. It was not formally published until November of 2025, more than 6 years after the airplane came down in the corn, and more than 3.5 years after it had been finished. It is worth being careful here, because bureaucracies are slow everywhere, and reports are delayed for dull reasons in every country, and it would be easy to reach for a conspiracy where mere sclerosis would do. But consider the shape of the whole thing. The state awarded its highest honor to the crew within 2 days, on the strength of a story. The film celebrated that story years later, and the one document that complicated that story, that said the heroes had made grave errors, that the airplane had not been doomed, that the underlying cause was a systemic failure the authorities had not fixed, was finished and then withheld from the public for years. Whether by design or by the simple institutional reluctance to publish something inconvenient, the effect was identical. The monument stood, clean and uncomplicated, while the evidence that would have qualified it stayed out of sight. A miracle had been declared, and the paperwork that might have downgraded it to a survivable accident badly handled was, for as long as possible, not allowed to speak. And there is a final, quieter scandal underneath all of it, which is that the thing that actually caused the accident was never really addressed at all. Flight 178 did not crash because of a mysterious act of God. It crashed because a flock of large gulls was allowed to occupy the airspace directly off the end of a runway used by airliners full of people. And that flock was there because the environment around Zhukovsky attracted it. And the environment was allowed to remain attractive because the airport's bird hazard management was inadequate, and the national rules governing it were obsolete. The investigators found illegal waste dumps. They found water bodies. They found a bird control regime that fell short of international standards and of the actual ornithological threat. That is a fixable problem. Bird strikes will never be eliminated. Birds and airplanes share the sky, and they always will, but the risk can be driven down dramatically by removing the things that concentrate birds near runways, and by aggressively dispersing the ones that gather anyway. This is routine at well-run airports around the world. What the Flight 178 investigation revealed was a country not doing it well enough. And in a bleak coda, the outdated national regulation that governed bird control, the one the investigators criticized, was, in 2020, formally rescinded, and, according to the report, nothing adequate was adopted to replace it, leaving airports across Russia operating under an unacceptable level of bird strike risk with no modern framework to manage it. The system did not tighten after Flight 178. In this specific and measurable way, it may have loosened. So the heroes got their medals, and the film got its release, and the meme got its t-shirts, and the report got its drawer, and the birds, the actual, physical cause of the whole event, went on gathering off the ends of Russian runways, no better managed than before. That is the anatomy of a Potemkin miracle, a bright, satisfying facade of heroism and national capability, erected at speed over an interior that was never repaired. Strip away the politics, and there is a real and permanent aviation lesson here, and it is not the one the film tells. The first part of it is about the limits of certification, and it is genuinely important. Flight 178 fell into a gap, a scenario in which multiple engines are damaged but not destroyed, each losing a different amount of thrust, the sum falling below what a single healthy engine would provide, a case the rules never contemplated because the rules are built around the failure of one engine while the other stays whole. Bird strikes, which tend to affect both engines at once, precisely because a flock is a distributed hazard, are the classic way to produce this uncertified condition. The Hudson ditching was one version of it. Flight 178 was another, and the industry has had to think hard in the years since about what a crew can even be expected to do when the airplane is in a state the test pilots never explored. There is no clean answer. But the honest acknowledgement that such states exist, that engine failure is not always a binary, that both engines out and both engines fine are not the only two options, is itself a piece of hard-won wisdom. The second part is about the memory items, and it is bleaker and simpler. When the world falls apart 10 seconds after takeoff, there is no time to diagnose, no time to reason, no time to understand the subtle truth that your engines are damaged rather than dead. There is only time to do the trained thing: full thrust, wings level, right attitude, balance the rudder, gear up on schedule, guard the speed. Those actions are trained precisely because they are the correct response to a whole family of low-altitude emergencies, including ones the crew cannot yet understand. Flight 178 is a brutal demonstration of what happens when, under the maximum possible stress, that training does not hold, when a crew, feeling doomed, stops flying the airplane and starts reacting to it. The gear stayed down, the thrust stayed back, the nose came up, and the speed came off. And an airplane that the numbers say could have climbed, did not. The third part is the one the state tried hardest to bury, and it is about honesty. An accident is an argument the world has with itself about how to be safer, and it only works if everyone is willing to hear an unwelcome answer. When a country decides in advance what the answer must be, decides that the men were heroes, and the machine was doomed and the system was blameless, and pins medals and makes films and withholds reports to protect that decision, it does not make the accident less tragic. It makes it more so, because it wastes it. The 233 people who survived Flight 178 survived a lesson. The lesson was there to be learned, in the flattened corn and the running engines and the gear that stayed down, and a great deal of effort was expended, for a great many years, to make sure it could not be. It is a strange thing to end an aviation story with no one dead, and it should be said plainly, because it is the best fact in the whole account. 233 people walked out of that cornfield alive, children who are now teenagers, holidaymakers who made it to the Black Sea a day late, a first officer of 23 who had, whatever else is true, been in the cockpit of an airplane that hit the ground at 140 knots and lived to fly another day. The survival was real. It was not in the end a miracle. Miracles do not leave flattened corn in front of a running engine, or a positive climb gradient unused in a simulation. But it was a genuine deliverance, purchased partly by luck, partly by the crashworthiness of a well-built airplane, and partly at the very last by a captain who chose a soft field and flew his airplane into it without losing control. What it was not was the thing the country needed it to be. It was not proof of anything except that people can survive terrible situations, that modern airliners are astonishingly tough, and that 90 seconds is not very long to save an airplane. The men at the controls were neither the heroes of the decree nor the villains of a harsher telling. They were two ordinary pilots who met an extraordinary and unfair situation, and did some of it badly and one crucial part of it well, and walked away, with everyone else, into a legend that was already being written before they had finished climbing out of the corn. Return to the beginning, the clear summer morning, the full airplane, the birds rising off the water at the end of the runway. In 90 seconds it was all over. The strike, the surge, the failure to climb, the wallowing descent, the corn. Everyone lived. And before the recorders had been read, before the engines had been opened, before anyone knew that the airplane had never lost the power to fly, the verdict was signed and sealed at the highest level of the state. A miracle, and two heroes to prove it. The truth took 6 years to be allowed out of its drawer, and when it emerged, it said something quieter and harder than the legend. That the airplane could have climbed, that the crew did not let it, that the birds should never have been there, and that the system which put them there was never fixed. Both stories are true. 233 people are alive, and that is a wonder, and a nation, offered the choice between a hero it could celebrate and a lesson it could learn, chose the hero, pinned on the medal, rolled the cameras, and locked the lesson away. Because sometimes a country needs a miracle more than it needs the truth, and it is always, always easier to declare one than to earn it.